Our presenter today is Dave Kataka. Without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Dave to go ahead and teach us all about fish pond management.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me. Like Dana said, my name is Dave Kataka, and I'm the district fisheries biologist for Fisheries District 5. And like Paul, if you listen, watch the Aruba Lake renovation, Paul is the assistant biologist for District 5. Our our district covers from around Terre Haute, Vigo County down to Vincennes, and then over to the border of Ohio. So we have around, I think it's like 18 counties, and we share some with other districts with, depending on the lake. But my office is out of the Bloomington field office on the east side of Bloomington. And today I want to talk to you about pond management. It's something that we get a lot of calls on certain times of year more than others. And let's get started here. So today, like I said, I'm going to talk about pond management. And I think one of the most important things as you start off thinking about managing ponds is to determining the use of your pond is actually, well, that's gonna put you in directions of management based on what you plan on doing with that pond. Whether it be irrigation for livestock to anywhere from golf course ponds and everything in between. You want to swim in it, you want to fish in it, stuff like that. So we'll talk about that. Pond design. You always want to start off. I'm going to start this talk with the mindset that you want to build a brand new pond. You have dirt. You have a place that you want the pond, and we're going to start from there. A lot of these stocking and management techniques that we're talking about are the same things that we use in fish management with the Fish Division of Fish and Wildlife. And I think maybe Paul brought that up with the Aruba Lake renovation. So we'll talk about pond design, proper fish stocking, and then we'll go through how you're going to manage your fishery through harvest and documentation, and then we'll finish up with aquatic vegetation management. That's always a popular one. And I actually slipped in a fish kill slide as well, just because this is a popular time, and in the last couple of weeks I've received several calls. So let's go here. If you want to build a new pond, you want to know what the soil type is, because you don't want to start digging a pond and find out that you have a sand vein or maybe a limestone bedrock that's going to drain your pond. So your local county extension office, soil and water resources conservation office in your county may be able to provide you with soil type maps. A few years ago, maybe a million years ago, the glaciers came down and scraped all the dirt off of Michigan, Wisconsin, that whole upper Midwest area, and deposited over Indiana. So the soil types can change actually within the meter. So it's very important to dig pilot holes to determine where your pond's going to be, and make sure that this is going to hold water. Another thing to consider is if your dam is over 10 or 20 feet high, the Division of Water is going to have to inspect that, and that'll probably require a permit. So definitely keep that in mind. Keep permits in mind as well too, because you don't want to find out after the fact that you were supposed to fill something out. We always say to build a pond, you want to go as big as you can, because an acre or greater. I have a lot of pond calls with half-acre ponds, and that's fine if that's all that the land will give you or your area or you can afford. But it's always one of those things where bigger is better. The more water you have, the more depth you have, the better it handles environmental changes like, maybe a heavy rain event, quick temperature changes in water, vegetation as well. So go big and go deep. The sides of your pond are also important. If you had a typical landscape where it's a valley, the water runs between it, and you're going to dam it up, make sure as you create that area, if you have extensive flats with vegetation, or extensive flats of shallow water, you're going to grow a lot of vegetation. And that's not always a bad thing. But if the majority of your pond is only 3 feet deep, that you're going to have a lot of vegetation. I mean, the rule of thumb is if light can hit the bottom, you're going to grow plants. So it's just like that, pickle jar or glass of water that you left on the back deck for a week or so. It came right out of the tap, but now you have algae growing in it. So the pond's no different other than it has more nutrients. So that's something to keep in mind. We generally say a 2-to-1 slope is always good to keep keep it deep enough that you can grow plants near shore, but as it gets deeper, the types of plants are going to diversify, and you probably won't have as much problems that way. Another thing is, if you're going to use this for fishing and swimming, it's fairly obvious. Don't water livestock in your pond or in the same watershed. As you build a pond, a drawdown structure, an overflow pipe, or even an overflow area is very important. And today, just in the past 10 years, we've just seen so many more flashy rain events and, horror stories of people's pond overflowing, cutting the dam out. And once water starts moving in that path of least resistance, it can cut down a dam really quickly. So having a designated overflow area is important. Plus, having a drawdown or a drain control structure that'll allow you to actually remove all the water at your pond is also very important, and you won't regret it. If your pond ever goes south or your fishery needs to change, that is the quickest way to turn a fishery around. Stocking fish, harvesting fish, turnarounds like that, you won't see results in a short amount of time. But if you start over like we did at Rubel Lake, and that's a pretty extreme situation, but to have that ability is always a plus. Okay, let's get to fish stocking. Fish species that do well in Midwestern ponds, in our area, are largemouth bass and bluegill. And as far as our recommendations go, we want a predator and a prey, and the predator being the largemouth bass and your prey being the bluegill. Stocking rates are very important. These are the same rates that we use in fish management. I think maybe Paul brought that up last week. We want a 5-to-1 predator or prey to predator. So we want 5 bluegills for every bass that we stock. And the recommended rate is 1,000 bluegills per acre for surface acre water to 200 bass per acre. Red ear sunfish also do well in ponds. They don't reproduce as well as bluegill, and they get bigger. They might grow a little faster, but in terms of being able to maintain a bass population, to have a mix of those would be bad. If you went straight red ear and largemouth bass, then you might want to change up your stocking numbers a little bit. But to have the blend that we use, or the recipe, you might say, that we use is 750 bluegill and 250 red ear sunfish per acre. So that's what we did at Rubel Lake, and we've done at other lakes. And then, of course, you leave the bass. I have on the slide, it says 125 to 200 bass per acre. But the important thing is that you want to start with the right ratio, and you want to stock these fish all the same age. And you want to stock them all at the same time. Sometimes that's not always possible, but that's what we recommend. Channel catfish are another great fish to have in ponds. They have very specific reproductive needs in terms of the way they spawn. They're considered what we call cavity spawners. They don't make the nest in the gravel like the little, the circular dishes or bowls in the substrate. These guys will actually get up under the banks. In river settings or other natural settings, they'll spawn underneath root wads and undercut banks. And most ponds don't have that type of substrate or habitat. So in this case, it's a good thing. When you put channel cat in there, they're not going to reproduce very well. So you pretty much know what you have. So it's very easy to keep track of your numbers that way over time. So if you harvest a couple of the big ones, then what is left. So you want to stock when the water's cool, and you want to stock all the same time. You want your fish to all grow up together. So as bluegill and bass start to grow, you want those bluegill to start spawning, and you want your bass to start eating them. So when you consider the size, as a rule of thumb, if a fish can stick it in its mouth, it'll eat it. So largemouth bass, of course, having a large mouth, they could probably start eating fish at 6 to 8 inches. The bluegill that you're stocking are generally anywhere, I say 1 to 2 on the slide, but it could be more like 2 to 3 by this time. Chances are they will not be able to stick their bluegill cousins in their mouth at that time, and they'll be mostly working on insects. So by the time the bluegill get old enough to start spawning, the bass will be big enough to start eating the little bluegill and then start controlling the population. So that's sort of the circle of life. There's fish that you do not want in your pond, and there's that are really, cause us headaches as fish managers. So the one thing you'll find out is when you get your pond is you're going to gain a lot of new friends. And these friends are going to offer a lot of things to help you out, help your pond out. They will offer to bring fish from another pond or go down to the river and catch you some more fish, or bring another fish in to clean the bottom out, stuff like that. That's like the worst thing you can do. If they're going to offer you fish in exchange for fishing, fish or beer, I would go with the beer and tell them to don't put anything in there. So problematic species like common carp, gizzard shad, and bullhead, these are very durable species and they reproduce like crazy. The problem that you run in with, for example, common carp, they reproduce well in almost any situation and they grow big fast. We found some 1-year-old carp at Griffey Lake when they drained that lake and we started over again. We weren't able to eradicate the fish population, but it was down to the stream channel for several years. And common carp were still in the channel when we filled it up. So we started seeing carp, and the 1-year-old, they were 12 inches long and they were beefy. So these common carp feed primarily on aquatic insects that are in the substrate or in the mud. In order to get those bugs, they can dredge up to about 6 inches of sediment. So in the process of getting food, they're resuspending, sediment from the bottom, mud. They're resuspending nutrients back in the water, nutrients that would be tied up in the substrate. They're making that available for algae growth. They can root up your aquatic plants, and in extreme cases, they can make the water so muddy you will not have any plants in that pond. It'll just be sort of a muddy pond with algae growing on the surface. Bullheads are very similar in that fact that they are very durable and they reproduce. Gizzard shad, the biggest problem we have with those is they reproduce like crazy. And they're primarily plankton feeders. And in most cases in the southern part of the state where we have gizzard shad, they make up about 50% of the population. So they take up a lot of space. They also compete for foods, being plankton feeders. They compete with every fish in your pond for food. So every larval fish that's spawned has to compete with this whole population of gizzard shad. So, like in the case of Rubel Lake, that was enough for us to pull the trigger on it, given the opportunity that they were draining the lake down anyway to start over with that fishery. Yellow perch, if you ever fish up in Michigan or the upper Midwest or even northern Indiana, we have some good perch fishing up there. We're very close to the southern edge of their range. So even though they will survive and you can put them in there, they generally don't get very big in warmer conditions, but they do reproduce, and you may just have a bunch of sub 6-inch perch. Crappie fishing is very popular, but we generally don't recommend putting crappie in your pond unless you have more than 10 acres or more. They are a cyclic population, meaning that they have highs and lows in their populations, and during most of that population swing over 10 years, they're not very big. So that's something just to consider as well. Plus they'll compete for food with your bass. species like walleye, muskie, striped bass, those are fish that we stock regularly in Indiana as part of our predator stocking program. And we stock those every year because we can, they're basically considered an unsustainable fishery unless we stock. So places that have excessive amounts of forage, some of the big core reservoirs that have gizzard shad populations or large riverine species in their thing in their fisheries. These are good fish to have because they're going to utilize those fish and then provide another fishing opportunity. If you were to put them in small ponds, less than 10 acres or so, you may run into water thermal issues. These fish, as they get bigger, they just need cooler water. So you could put them in there. They may grow. They won't reproduce. And how fast they grow is really, up to the water conditions of your pond. Smallmouth bass are very similar in that they require cooler water. Now, when I say cooler water, and you think of your typical pond throughout the rest of my district. I mean, I know there's a lot of people from, the strip pit areas, Vigo County, Clay, Sullivan, Green. These waters are unique in that they probably could support smallmouth bass, and actually we have tried it at Island Pit on the old Minnehaha property. That program, we only got one stocking out of it, and then I think the property ended up being taken back by the coal company, so we never really figured out how it worked. The things that we have noticed with smallmouth bass in Indiana is if you find those populations together with largemouth tend to outcompete them. And all I can think of is probably a thermal issue. You just do, largemouth do better in warm water. There's 67 different species of fish in our streams in Indiana. And in that, there could be 30 species of sunfish. So when someone says, I'll catch some bluegill for you and bring them to your pond, there's a very good chance you could end up with like a green sunfish, a warmouth, long-eared sunfish, fish that don't get as big, and they probably wouldn't be as desirable as a species have in there as, like just a regular bluegill or red ear. With the Division of Fish and Wildlife, we generally do not move fish from water to water unless we can test those fish or designate that these fish are healthy. So as a rule of thumb, it's probably not a good idea to catch fish from another pond and bring them to your pond. There's pathogens out there, the diseases that we know about, parasites, and there's stuff that we don't know about. So as a rule of thumb, it's probably just probably not a good idea. So now that you have your fish in your pond and you're trying to figure out, how things are going, how are things progressing? When we do fish surveys with on state waters, we use electrofishing, we use gill nets, we use trap nets, and that gives us the advantage because we can collect fish when they're not hungry. So we get a snapshot picture of every fish in that lake, or to the most part, all the different species. So by having fish like bluegill bass, red ear, channel catfish, these are all fish that can be commonly caught on hook and line. Unless you go with some sort of minnow species or something like that. So you should be able to figure out, the status of your pond by just fishing it, and just keep fishing it, and keep records, because things are going to change every year, and you're going to start establishing trends like the fish are either getting bigger, they're stalling out at this size, that type of thing. And be sure to date that. So when you're catching lots of fish in the spring, it's not, you just may not catch as many in August. I get pond calls all the time like, my fish are gone. I mean, that's the way they start off with it. And I'm like, well, the first starts, I have this pond, and now my fish are gone. And I want to know what happened to them. And he was fishing a pond in April and May when all the fish were spawning. It was easy to see them. They were easy to catch. And then he calls me, end of August. It's 100 degrees out. It's, extremely stagnant, and it's just more difficult to catch fish. So, it's just one of those things that could be a seasonal thing. So just keep track of it. Keep track of your catches. And if you're not really a fisherman, you can invite people over to fish. Just give them boundaries to figure out, if you take fish out, keep track of them. And if you catch fish and release, keep track of them. So it's fairly pretty straightforward. If you're happy with the fishery, chances are things are fine. So some of the scenarios that we run into are we have either a stunted a stunted prey population like bluegill or stunted predator population like bass. And what we mean by stunting is usually that species is in competition for itself for food and space. So in the case of a stunted bluegill population, you may not find any bluegill above, say, 6 or 7 inches. And every fish is right around that range or below. I have seen cases where it was a stunted bluegill population, and the bluegill were about 3 to 4 inches was the primary size, and they would swim in a giant school right along shore and just circle the pond. And that is a situation where they're basically looking for food. It was not very prevalent, and because they were eating all up, and they were in direct competition with themselves, so that population just doesn't grow very well. In most cases, when I hear about that, the bass are usually pretty good. The bass in the pond they're quality size. You got a lot of fish between that 10 and 12 inch range, and there's catchable populations of fish that are larger than that. So then in that case, it's, for bass fishing, that's pretty good. So in the case of, a stunted bluegill population, you want to have as many bass in there as you can, because you want them to eat as many bluegill as you can. In some cases, if the weeds are too thick, that gives you too much habitat or too much hiding places for little bluegill, and these bass can't get to those fish to eat them. You may consider a vegetation control plan to reduce the amount of cover. And conversely, this happens more often than not, that ponds will have an overpopulation of bass, and you won't be able to find bass. It's very difficult to catch bass over 10 to 12 inches. But in this case, a lot of times the bluegill and red ear they're quality size. We're talking 7 to 10 inch fish. So, and that's because the bass are creating room and space for bluegill to grow. They're keeping the population down. The bluegill aren't competing with themselves for food, so there's plenty of room and there's plenty of space for them to go around. This is a little bit easier thing to control or turn around by yourself, because bass are easy to catch on hook and line, and their numbers probably aren't as high as, say, like a bluegill population, where on a stunted bluegill population, it's hard to catch a 3 to 4 inch bluegill in numbers, whereas bass, their mouths are pretty big. You can pretty much catch those on pretty much anything that'll fit in their mouth. So it might be a little easier to harvest those fish. So don't be afraid to harvest. Past 20 years, catch and release, maybe even 30 years, catch and release has become so popular. It's almost detrimental to our, even our bigger lakes or state lakes, because the bass populations get so heavy because no one harvests them anymore. And there's just not enough food to go around. Growing big fish is not hard. The theory behind it, it's just implementing it. Fish need to have food and they need to have space. And it's hard to do that when there's too many of them. So I get a lot of calls about fish parasites, and we'll touch on this real quickly. There's a website right here on our page. There's a page on our website, I'm sorry, that talk about fish parasites, and I'll go over this real quickly. The most common fish parasites that we have are yellow grub, white grub, and black spot. And the black spot is just what it sounds like. You'll see fish with little black dots all over their skin. And the yellow grub and white grub they're little worms or grubs that you see in the flesh when you fillet them out. And, they're sort of gross looking, but if you take your knife, you can flick them out. All these parasites, these 3 parasites, humans are not part of their host. You're not part of their chain of life. So if you were to eat these by accident raw, you would probably just pass them through. Your skin wouldn't fill up with black dots or anything like that. So eating them will not be a problem, but just like any freshwater fish, you want to cook things through thoroughly, and that will take care of that as well. Problem that makes these things difficult to control is it's a three-host life cycle. If you were to start in the fish, the fish has the parasite. The bird eats the fish like a kingfisher or a blue heron. It works its way through the digestive system. They crap out a cyst. That cyst morphs into a different life cycle, goes into a snail. And in some cases, they are specific birds and specific hosts. Host animals like, only one will go to a blue heron and only one will go to a kingfisher. And same for snails. I just don't know my snails very well. So after it hits the snail, then that is either, it morphs into a different stage. It floats up and attaches itself to a fish, and then it starts all over again. So in terms of trying to get rid of parasites, it's very difficult. And the good news is if you cook them through, it's not bad. But like I said, if you don't like it to look at it, there's no reason you have to eat it. Aquatic vegetation is a big topic, and I could talk an hour or more, even more on this. So we'll give you the basics, and if we have questions or you want to get into this at another time, we can do that. Aquatic vegetation is very important to ponds. If you go up to, let's say, like the natural lakes, either northern Indiana or even Michigan, Wisconsin, you will notice that lakes up there have a lot of plants, and there are a lot of different plants, and that diversity is what makes those such productive environments. So the benefits of aquatic vegetation are, of course, fish habitat, and green plants produce. A rule of thumb is green plants produce oxygen and dead ones don't. So, and we'll get into that in a second. They, rooted plants, they're going to consolidate the sediment of your pond. So during wind action, maybe wave action, it's going to keep that sediment from moving or help prevent that. And it'll protect your shoreline as well. And it's free fish habitat, like I said. There's a lot of initiatives now to put habitat in your pond. And this stuff is free. So some of the drawbacks are that, it doesn't look good. If you have mat forming algae over your pond, or, plants that are growing so high that they're just laying flat and matting out the surface. In some cases, they can get so thick you can't even, oxygen won't be produced underneath it. In case of duckweed and watermeal, I've seen it where it gets about, couple to 6 inches thick, and there's no oxygen underneath it because the light can't even shine through it. We generally say in a pond situation, and even our lakes, it's nice to have at least 20 to 25% aquatic vegetation coverage on your pond. That gives you enough coverage for nursery habitat for your fish. A lot of aquatic insects like to colonize on those plants, and in some cases, fish even spawn on those plants. But excessive amounts of vegetation can, like we said earlier, hinder bass predation on your bluegill. They also get in the way of swimming. No one likes to swim through weeds. They can actually be dangerous at times. It's not if you're not anticipating it, can be sort of scary. So developing a weed now I have a weed control plan in there because the vegetation control wouldn't fit in the header. So I have a weed, but I like to call it aquatic vegetation. It's not all bad. The most important thing is to identify the species, because that's going to determine what type of control method you're going to use, whether it be a chemical control, aquatic herbicide, or biological control, or even manual removal. So you're going to treat algae differently than you will rooted or vascular plants. Copper sulfate is probably the go-to algicide. And anymore, there's a lot of different aquatic herbicides that are good for broad spectrum use, and they're in various formulations, anywhere from granular to liquid, and they're much easier to apply and safe to use. When we do weed control, it's a rare occasion that you want to treat your whole pond. We recommend spot treating, and spot treating where you want to recreate. Say, like, if you had a beach and a dock where you put your boat or whatever, treat around those areas where it's going to be a hindrance. But other than that, if you can maintain that 20 to 25% coverage, it's healthier for your pond. And early off, we talked about what are we going to use this pond for? That's going to determine what type of product to use. There's some really good herbicides out there that last in the water a long time. And they work great on watermeal and duckweed, which is a very difficult plant to control. And the benefit of something like a Floridome based or Sonar, what we call Sonar, is that it lasts long in the water, and it's a photosynthetic inhibitor. And basically, it starves the plant, it keeps it from producing food or energy sugars through it breaks up that photosynthetic food production. If you have Sonar in your pond, you don't want to be irrigating your garden. We had a case up at Silver Lake where we were doing an experimental Sonar or Floridone application on Silver Lake, and everyone was notified through the homeowners association, or lake association, that this is going on. We're targeting the invasive Eurasian water milfoil. Don't use this for irrigation. And there's a lot of hoses and pumps and stuff on this lake where they would pump water and water their garden, water their yard with it. And we could tell this guy did not read his newsletter, because he had like 4-foot tomato plants in his garden and they were all white. His whole garden was white. And that's that signature takeaways, or what you see when you see Floridone damage on plants, is they turn white because it takes away all their green. Livestock is another thing to consider. There's a lot of safe herbicides out there that don't require any fish consumption restriction time or swimming. And anymore, there's no reason to even use the other products that have those consumption or restricted times after application. So that's something else to consider. I've also heard, even in coal country down there in Sullivan County, that some people are buying up property and they're actually using those strip pits for a water supply. And that's something else that you want to consider too when you're applying aquatic herbicides. Advantages, and I sort of touched on this before, there are advantages and disadvantages to using chemical or herbicide, approved aquatic herbicides. The advantage is, it's quick. You can use what we call contact herbicides, and stuff like copper sulfate and diquat-based herbicides. It's like mowing the grass. It will kill whatever it touches. In the case of rooted plants with diquat, it won't kill the roots. You're just basically removing that biomass above it. And you can have control over an area, but you'll still have rooted plants come back later, which in most cases is good, because you don't want to remove all the plants in certain areas. And that, in the same token, you can be selective. You can remove an aquatic invasive species by timing and by using, the specific herbicide. A lot of our aquatic invasive species, the biggest problem with those is they grow before everything else does. 50 degrees is like the magic temperature for a lot of our native vegetation and algae. Plants really don't grow well below that. Plants like Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, those things grow as soon as the ice is out. As soon as they start getting sun during the winter, they can start popping. And that's what they do, is they take up space before our other plants can grow. And it's just like any other terrestrial invasive. The disadvantages, there's a lot of folks that don't like to use chemicals. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's other methods. Just keep in mind that the turnaround time or your results is going to be a lot less unless you do something like hand removal. Aquatic herbicides can be expensive, and depending on the area that you want to treat or the size of your pond, it could get very expensive. I talked about earlier, green plants produce oxygen, dead ones don't. If you kill off too much vegetation at once, you run the risk of causing a fish kill. This time of year, when your water temperature is between 75 and 80 and above, killing off too much plants at one time can deplete your oxygen to the point where you can cause a fish kill overnight. Warm water just does not hold oxygen as well as cold water. So treating this time of year can be risky. Excuse me. So you want them to take care of, what you're targeting and how much you're going to, how much you're going to apply. And if you have to treat, you never treat the whole lake. If you have to do an algae treatment this time of year, only treat half to a quarter of the pond at a time and spread that treatment out over a month. Just got to be patient. Grass carp is what we consider a biological. There's another biological out there that's been talked about for about 20 years, and it's a bacteria, similar to the stuff in your Rid-X that you put in your septic tank. And the theory is that it digests nutrients in your pond and also can break down organic matter and knock down the muck, so to speak, that's in your pond. I have not personally used that. And, it's out there, but I don't really hear many people talking about it. But on the same token, people don't call me when things are going well. They don't call me when their grass carp are working, or they don't call me when their use of bacteria for algae control is out there. So this may be a little bit biased information saying that it doesn't work or whatever, but from the stories that I get, it's usually when they're not working. Like I said, grass carp are a biological control method. They are the fish that you purchase from a licensed hatchery. Those fish are designated through the permit system. They have to be a sterile fish, or what they call a triploid fish. They have 3 sex chromosomes, making them sterile. So what you put in that pond is what you get, and they should not reproduce. As far as a biological control method, they're going to eat plants. And, over the course of, 10 years, it may be cheaper if you have excessive amounts of vegetation and the plants that they like to eat, they're going to take care of it. And since they are, eating them and not killing off your entire pond at once, the, oxygen depletion, there are scenarios where it may be less. So the disadvantages of grass carp are, similar. They, you can't make a grass carp eat just on your beach, or you can't make them eat right near your pier. And the things that we run into with grass carp, and it's usually about 15 years down the road, 10, 15 years down the road, is that I have a bunch of grass carp in my pond. I don't have any vegetation. The water looks very cloudy and muddy. And how do I get rid of them? Because after about, between 7 and 10 years, they lose their effectiveness as far as the amount of vegetation they eat. They just get big and they just sort of wallow around out there. So the theory is, after that time, you need to remove them and replace them. Well, removing these fish is very difficult. For one thing, they're very large, and it's hard to catch them on hook and line. So short of shooting them with a bow and arrow or, snagging them with a big hook, it's very difficult to get rid of them. Most people just keep adding more fish and not taking the big ones out. The places where I recommend grass carp are places like golf course ponds, where fishing is not a priority. That lake may be used for irrigation of the fairways of the greens, and you don't want to use herbicides. And, they're going to take care of the problem and reduce the amount of overall care, or, the daily care or weekly, monthly care that goes along with running a pond of that sort. So you'll see them a lot in subdivision retention ponds and golf courses. This is a grass carp that we took out of Baumert Lake in Washington, Indiana. Oh, I can't even remember how old it is. It's got to be close to 20 years old, but this is a 60-inch fish that weighed 50 pounds. And there are a few of these left. I've seen we've drained some lakes recently down at the Glendale property. Those fish were over, one stocking would have been 27 years old, and we found over 20 fish out there. So when we say they take up space, on average, in the Midwest, when we talk about volume of water, an acre foot of water is one surface acre of water that's 1 foot deep. And on average throughout the Midwest, an acre foot of water can support about 350 pounds of biomass. And that, the biomass is, that's fish, That's plants, that's aquatic insects, that's plankton, that's everything. So you can see, it's like a cornfield. If you have a cornfield full of ragweed, you just don't produce that much corn. A pond's the same way. If you have a pond full of 50-pound grass carp, your production of your pond is taken up maintaining this fish along with the space. So it's nice to have a biological control thinking it's working for you, but eventually they're going to take up space and like gizzard shad being, approximately 50% of your fish population, that just takes up energy away from your good species. Manual removal. This is probably your best option in terms of the health of your pond, because you are removing the vegetation. You're also taking that vegetation and the nutrients that made to grow that plant out of your pond. Don't just leave it on the bank. You want to move it off, off site, so it does, as it breaks down, the nutrients don't go back in your pond. In this case, this is my daughter and my son. They are at my father-in-law's pond in Pennsylvania. He had a small pond that was overrun with water thread pondweed, and we wanted to clear the drain structure because it was blocking it. And about 6 or 7 hours later, the kids really decided that it was much more fun to take it out with their bodies than it was to rake it out. Much easier. So they made some nice clothings and some little weed monuments on the bank. I have a daughter that's starting college right now, and we may need some tuition money. So if you need some help, we can work out a deal. Lake dyes. You've seen some of these ponds, you might drive by them, and they have like a blue tint to them, almost like a tidy bowl type blue. And the theory behind the dyes are it inhibits light from penetrating and hitting the bottom. We talked about earlier having too many shallows in your pond. The theory behind lake dyes is it inhibits light from penetrating and hitting the bottom. And it's supposed to be able to reduce your algae growth. In some cases it works if you have steep-sided banks, because that the water column and the dye help prevent light from penetrating. If you have a lot of shallows, say like less than a foot, foot and a half, I don't know that you can put that much dye in there. It just doesn't work when it's shallow. Plus, since being it's a dye and not an actual herbicide, as it rains, it dilutes. So every time it rains, you're going to have to reapply. The other thing with this is it is a dye, and if you apply it to your pond, in some cases I've had some calls where they applied it to their pond and their dog swam through it right as soon as they put it down, and they had a blue dog for about a month. It's basically a food coloring. It's not dangerous, but you got a funny colored dog though for a while. There are weed barriers that you can put down. They're like permeable matting, similar to what you'd put in your landscape. Keep the mulch from disappearing into your dirt. These are fibrous. They let bubbles through, so you don't have problems with gas building up and popping it up out of the water. So you can put those down. That'll help. Anymore in our state hatchery, some of those ponds, they've gone to rubber liners, lined ponds, and that can really reduce the amount of rooted vegetation you have. They're really expensive, very durable, but it's quite an investment. There's also the option of drawing a lake down, and we've done this in some cases where you have a drain control structure and you can pull the lake down several feet and expose the bottom to freezing. And that's always the problem is you just never know in Indiana, especially southern India, how long you're going to have a freeze. You need a good, you need to freeze that substrate down pretty deep to get to those roots and really take those plants out. And of course, dredging is always an option, or if you have excessive amount of cattails, to get rid of those big tubers and some of the seeds that may be buried down in there. I heard that cattail seeds can live dormant for 20 years, and as soon as you get them in the right conditions of soil and sunlight, they start growing again. So I just added this because this slide this morning, because I started thinking, the last dozen fish kill or phone calls I get about pond management come down to fish kills, and I think what you got to remember is fish kills are totally natural. How many people have had fish in their fish tank or their goldfish bowl? They don't live forever, and that's in a very controlled situation with temperature, food source. Everything you can do everything right and fish die. In nature, that's even more so because you have extremes in weather, you have extremes in water chemistry, and disease. So the most I usually get most of my fish kill calls in the spring, around the time fish are spawning, and in the fall as the lake starts to what they call turn over. You know, you have stratification over the summer where your warm water's on the top, your warm oxygenated water's on the top of your pond, top half of your pond, and then the bottom is cool. Light doesn't penetrate, and you don't have any oxygen. And as that mixes, you run the risk of, we talked about dead plants take up oxygen. As you mix stuff up from the bottom, you can run into those issues too. And I think that a lot of things that cause fish kills in the spring are based on weather. We're coming out of winter. The water temperature rises. We have great, beautiful spring, early or late winter days. Starts to warm up, and your algae production just skyrockets. You have this big plankton bloom, single-celled algae. You get a little bit green in the water, and then we get some monsoon that comes through, and it rains 2 or 3 inches, and that rain is what it does is, or cloudy weather can knock that plankton bloom down to the point where it dies. And being a single cell plant, it breaks down very quickly and can suck the oxygen up right away. So unfortunately, when you have what's called a dissolved oxygen crash, it affects the biggest fish first. So it's really can be heartbreaking to go out there and, this pond that you've been taking care of and growing with for decades, and all of a sudden you see a lot of dead big fish. And in some cases, it may be the fact that, the pond's very old. It was at its carrying capacity anyway for large, for large amounts of fish. And this is sort of the way of saying that the pond needs to correct itself. We got too many fish in here, and any of these natural events that would have happened with not many fish in there may not have caused a fish kill. But if you have a lot of fish in there, this is a way that it sort of corrects itself. Now, the good news is it's pretty rare that you kill every fish in your pond for a natural event like this. And the fish that are left, like we said earlier, the more space, the more food, the faster they grow. So ponds generally recover pretty quickly. When people call about fish kills, I generally don't recommend restocking right away. I recommend, just like we did before, keep fishing it, take good notes, and I wouldn't pull the trigger yet on stocking unless you can line some dots up together of poor fishing. So we talked about fish kills, weather. Most of it is weather. It has to do with weather, and these days with more flashy rain events, more hot rain events, during fish spawning time, drastic changes in temperature are really, fish don't like that. They're not very strong coming out of winter, and that's just, they're more susceptible to disease. We have a new online, we updated our pond management page on the DNR website. So there's a lot of really good information on this. Here's the link. I believe Dana will be providing that to you later, or the whole presentation. So this is the link. If you can't get to that, just go to our DNR site and you just click on this search engine over here and type in the box, private pond management. And that'll bring up a lot of good stuff for you. We've been doing some work with Purdue Extension. We worked together on a fish stocking page, fact sheet for ponds, for fish ponds or private ponds. And they're also working on management of small ponds, fact sheet. So that I think that's, I don't remember if that's out or if it's coming out. The other thing to consider too is when you're having a pond, maybe a farm pond, there's a lot of, your pond is only as good as the watershed around it. If you have a lot of runoff, farm runoff, sediment runoff, there's a land management programs that benefit wildlife that can help you maintain good water quality in your pond. And the beauty of some of these programs is a terrestrial habitat management, whether it be for pollinators, quail. Some of these programs have cost share with them. There is no cost share for pond management. So if you want to manage your, the land around your pond, you can talk to your district wildlife biologist or the extension office and figure out if these programs will fit for you. Like I said there earlier, there's 6 district biologists for fisheries. This is the map. This also can be found on our website. And, if you have questions, you can give us a call. With that, I can handle any questions. This is my my email address and my office phone. I don't know if you saw a picture of me, but I'm in my bedroom right now. I've been sent home about mid-March, and I'm still working from home. But I can all my phone calls come right back to me as a message on email. So make sure you leave a message if you have any questions. With that, I just got back from vacation up in Minnesota, and I had to show off some great fish pictures. Since this is a fish talk, so to speak, I have to show you some pictures. So this is went and spent a couple days with my college buddies 33 years ago, fishing for walleye and smallmouth up on Mille Lacs in Minnesota. So with that, I'm done. If you have any questions, we can work on those, and I can stick around as long as you need.
Those are some beautiful fish.
It's such a beautiful place, but there's potential for that in Indiana. We have sunshine.
Very, very true. We did have one question through the chat box. Does a rubber liner help prevent your pond from draining if there's a slow leak, possibly from limestone beneath the pond?
Yes, it will. Yep. I mean, the pond liners are designed to be, like a pool liner. They're the ones that we use in our fish hatcheries. They are very thick, and the way they actually glue those together, they're supposed to be guaranteed not to leak. They said you can drive a truck across it and it won't leak. So there's other ways of patching ponds, but it's very difficult, and it almost comes down to you have to drain the pond and maybe work some bentonite clay in there at night, or I can't even remember what it's called, but there is a company that used to make or still makes pea gravel that is coated with a bentonite clay, and they claim that you can broadcast this pea gravel over the pond bottom or where where you think the leak might be. And wherever that pea gravel settles, that clay will expand and supposedly patch the leak. I've just seen it in workshops. I've never seen it actually in use, but that might be something else to look up to. I'll look into as well.
So now we're going to farm your wide experience and asking for the best hotspots in your district for fishing based off your survey work.
Oh. Every lake is special in my district. No, right now, I mean, it really depends on what the species of fish you're after. Do you have a boat? Are you going to be fishing from shore? How far do you want to travel? Like I said, the district runs all the way to Ohio. Right now, West Boggs is on fire for bluegill, red ear, crappie, and bass. Now, that was a lake that we renovated similar to Rubel Lake. But that's been 6 years now, and the fishing is just fantastic. Unfortunately, everyone knows about it. So it's actually, it's a very busy lake, too. Dogwood Lake, which is on the Glendale Fish and Wildlife area, that's in Davies County. That's about a half hour from West Boggs. That has been consistent since the 70s as being one of the best fisheries in the state. It's 1,400 acres. It's loaded with standing timber. It's got a lot of aquatic vegetation. And I mean, the biggest problem with that lake is it's relatively big. Well, it is big, and every place looks like it has fish. So you just never know. You're always thinking I should probably go somewhere else if I'm not catching something because everything else looks better. That lake, since it has so much boating hazards, it doesn't have an outboard limit, but it does have a speed limit on it. So that also keeps the skiers and the jet skis down. So you can go out there and you don't have to worry about getting run over by a large boat. So, let's see, what else do we have? Sullivan Lake. We just did a creel survey out there. We stock hybrid walleye at Sullivan Lake, and we really got some good returns on those. That's a county-run lake. There is an entrance fee to that, but they do have aid station, camping, and a lot of the family amenities. Plus, it's just really good fishing for crappie, bass, and now the saugeye. It's got a great catfish population as well.
Did we have any more questions for Dave?
My contact information's all there, so really, anytime.
There was one more question that came in.
Great.
Does using copper sulfate affect spawning in a negative way?
You know, it's been used for such a long time, I would say not. The only thing that you may run into with copper sulfate is if you kill too much kill too much algae over a spawning bed, those fish they get so stubborn that they won't leave. So if it's a big shallow flat and you kill too much vegetation and you drop the oxygen out, those fish won't leave, they'll die. So that would, the chemical aspect of using copper sulfate doesn't inhibit spawning, but it does, it could in a negative way, cause low dissolved oxygen just through the biological process of the algae breaking down.
All right. I wanted to mention that this Zoom this WebEx is being recorded, and we're going to make it available so that people can look back through this later if they'd like. We're also going to share the resources that were shared through this presentation, as well as Dave, you mentioned that this presentation could be shared. And yes, we will be offering a survey just to see what we did well, what we can improve on, and get feedback from the program as a whole. So with that, I think that we can say thank you, Dave. It's been wonderful having you speak with us, and
you're welcome.
Enjoy today, which is National Go Fishing Day.
Is it really?
Well, that's what Kurt said.
Well, I guess I'll have to go then. So, all righty. Well, thanks for having me. And like I said, my contact information is there. If you want to talk about places to fish or, private pond management, I think I'm not sure if I put it out there, but, covering such a big district, we can consult for pond management over the phone, but we don't do any house calls. So there are private companies that will do take care of, application issues and stuff like that. So if you want to talk more, just let me know.